Have you ever looked at the sweep of human history? You know, the incredible cooperation, the devastating conflicts, the way societies seem to rise and fall in patterns, and wondered if there's something more than just a jumble of events? Like, are there universal principles, maybe even a kind of science that explains why we do what we do, why we stick together so fiercely in groups, but clash so intensely with outsiders?
Well, we've taken a deep dive into some absolutely fascinating source material that suggests exactly that. It puts forward this idea of a science of history, and it centers around a core concept it calls the tribal algorithm. Yeah, it's a really interesting approach. It's not just about, listing dates and battles. It's really digging for the underlying universal forces that have shaped human affairs across vast stretches of time, different cultures. In this analysis, it makes a powerful case that there's a fundamental evolved psychological mechanism, this tribal algorithm for group cooperation and conflict, that's basically the engine driving so much of the human story.
Okay, so our mission in this deep dive, we're going to try and unpack this framework layer by layer. We'll zoom out to the cosmic scale, then zoom right into the biology and psychology, see how it's played out in actual history. We'll also wrestle with the pretty profound ethical questions it raises, and maybe explore what the science might tell us about building a better future.
And what's really exciting about this material is just how interdisciplinary it is. It's pulling together insights from everywhere. Natural sciences, social sciences, humanities. It blends rigorous quantitative methods with psychology, philosophy, deep historical knowledge. We're talking going from the literally cosmic scale of big history right down to the mathematical models used in fields like cryodynamics. It's quite the range.
Okay, let's start there. This idea of a science of the past. How does thinking about history scientifically in this way differ from the traditional approaches most of us learned?
Well, traditionally, history is very much focused on the unique narrative, isn't it? The specific events, the individual leaders, the particular cultural context. And I mean, that rich detail is crucial. Absolutely. But the scientific approach, it shifts the focus. It's looking for generalizable patterns, trying to find causal mechanisms that repeat across different times and places, looking for predictable dynamics in how societies actually behave over the long run. And that means you can't just look at history in isolation. You really need insights from sociology to understand social structures, anthropology for culture and ritual, economics for resource dynamics, psychology for why people behave the way they do, technology studies for the impact of innovations. The source gives examples like using social network theory to understand revolutions or applying insights from anthropology about rituals' power. It's about using all these different lenses to explain why things happen in a way that isn't just specific to one time or place, but maybe reveals a deeper recurring pattern.
So it really zooms way out first, right? Tell us about big history. That cosmic scale sounds immense.
It really is. Big history gives us the ultimate context for the human story. It literally looks at the past from the very beginning, the Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago, all the way to today. The goal was to find these universal patterns, these kind of dramatic threshold moments where complexity increases significantly. The formation of stars, planets, the origin of life, complex organisms, and then much, much later, our own species. What it does really is place human history within this much grander cosmic Earth and life history. It shows us that humanity is a very recent arrival and, a pretty contingent outcome of these huge processes. This really challenges traditional history, which often just starts 5,000 years ago with farming or writing. It kind of skips over hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution as hunter-gatherers, and that period fundamentally shaped our psychology, our social instincts. From this perspective, the basic laws of physics and biology aren't separate from human history. They're kind of the underlying operating system everything else runs on.
Right. And then, almost paradoxically, it zooms way, way in to the mathematical side with something called cryodynamics.
It's exactly. Yeah, cryodynamics. It's a field really pushed forward by Peter Turchin in the early 2000s. And it takes this scientific approach specifically to macrohistorical patterns, big stuff. It treats history as a potential analytical, maybe even predictive science, focusing on these large-scale dynamics like why do empires rise and fall? Why do populations boom and bust? What drives periods of political instability? The core idea is to use a dynamical systems approach. You translate theories about historical forces, say population pressure, how resources are shared, state finances, social unrest, stuff like that, into mathematical models. These models describe how different variables interact over time. And then this is key. You test these models rigorously against huge historical databases. The source mentions things like the SEICHAT, Global History Databank, which compiles tons of information about past societies. This lets researchers actually test, say, hundreds of different hypotheses for why the Roman Empire fell and see which ones actually fit the data. It's building on older ideas too, like from the 14th century thinker Ibn Khaldun. He talked about asabiya, social cohesion, driving the rise and fall of dynasties. Cliodynamics tries to formalize insights like that. Now, you might be thinking, doesn't this risk oversimplifying things? Yep, history is messy, right? Critics definitely raise that point. Those reducing societies to data points miss the contingency, the culture, individual choices. And the source acknowledges that. The argument isn't that history is like clockwork, rigidly predetermined. It's more that history, while definitely contingent, is also powerfully shaped and constrained by these recurring patterns. Patterns rooted in, well, universal aspects of human nature. The science tries to understand those patterns and the mechanisms behind them.
Is this concept called the tribal algorithm? What exactly is this?
Right. It's described as an evolved psychological predisposition. Maybe think of it less like actual computer code and more like a deep-seated set of processes, often unconscious in our minds. It's basically the mechanism that sorts the world into us and them. Simple as that, but profound consequences. It drives us to show immense loyalty, cooperation, preference towards members of our own group, our in-group. But at the same time, it often leads us to feel suspicion, indifference, or even hostility towards outsiders of the outgroup. And the argument in the source is that this isn't just one factor among many in human history. It's potentially the fundamental engine. It shapes everything: small family units, huge empires, community building, ethnic cleansing. Because it's presented as a core feature of our shared human nature, something forged over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, it's something that affects everyone, every culture, across time.
Wow. Okay, so how does this algorithm actually work in our minds? What are the psychological mechanics? How do we actually do this us versus them thing?
Yeah, the best framework we have for understanding that comes from social identity theory, developed by Henri Tajfel and John Turner. Their work basically shows that a big chunk of our self-concept, how we see ourselves, and even our self-esteem, comes from the groups we belong to. It's fundamental to who we think we are. It seems to work in three main steps. First, social categorization. Our brains just automatically categorize people into groups. It's a shortcut to make sense of a complex social world. And the most basic categories are us, the in-group, and them, the out-groups. Second, social identification. Once we're categorized, we identify with our in-group. We start adopting its norms, its values, its behaviors. The group's identity becomes part of our identity. Its wins feel like our wins, its losses feel personal. And third, social comparison. We naturally compare our in-group to other groups. And because our self-esteem is tied up with our group identity, we're driven to see our group positively, to achieve what they call positive distinctiveness. And this naturally leads to in-group favoritism. Preferring our own group, and often, though not always, out-group derogation, viewing other groups more negatively.
That's fascinating. So it's almost automatic.
Very much so.
Wow.
Tajfel did these famous minimal group experiments. He put people into groups based on totally arbitrary things like flipping a coin or preferring one painting over another. And even in those meaningless groups, people still showed favoritism towards their own new group members when they had to allocate resources. It just shows how readily our minds create these boundaries and start preferring us.
Okay, is this purely psychological, a sort of mental habit? Or is there something deeper going on? Is it like wired into us biologically?
There's definitely evidence for a biological basis. This tribal algorithm isn't just an abstract idea. It seems our brains are kind of built to do it. Neuroscience studies, using fMRI brain scans, show our brains actually respond differently to people we perceive as in-group versus out-group. The brain's reward system lights up more for in-group members, reinforcing that loyalty. Our empathy circuits seem to be more active when we see someone from us in distress. Conversely, the amygdala, which is involved in fear and threat detection, often shows a heightened response to faces perceived as belonging to outgroups, even based on something really simple, like race. It suggests an evolved predisposition for, in-group safety and a certain wariness of outsiders.
Wow. And what about hormones? I think the source mentioned oxytocin.
Yes, oxytocin. It's famous as the love hormone or the bonding hormone. But the research is fascinatingly complex. Studies show its effects are often parochial, meaning groupish. It increases trust, empathy, cooperation towards in-group members. But, and this is the kicker, it can simultaneously increase suspicion, defensiveness, even prejudice towards outgroup members. It's remarkable, really. The same biological mechanism that helps us form loving bonds within our group can also amplify negative reactions to those outside it.
So it's psychology and biology working together.
Exactly. You have this psychological sorting mechanism, social identity theory, and it seems to be underpinned by this biological wiring. Our brains are primed for it, and when you aggregate that individual psychology across millions of people over long periods, that's what creates the macro-historical patterns we see. The recurring themes of tribal conflict, nationalism, strong group identities, they're all different expressions, different outputs of this fundamental us versus them program running in the human brain. The specific label for the group changes family, clan, religion, nation, political party, but the underlying psychological and biological process stays remarkably consistent.
Okay, so if this has evolved, it must have offered some survival advantage, right? But from a simple survival of the fittest individual viewpoint, why would we evolve to help other people, especially if it costs us something? That altruism seems like a puzzle.
It absolutely does seem like a puzzle if you only think about the individual competing against everyone else. But that's where fields like sociobiology and evolutionary psychology came in. They specifically tackled this. How can cooperation and even self-sacrifice evolve through natural selection? The first big piece of the puzzle is kin selection. The core idea is that natural selection acts on genes, not just individuals, and you share genes with your relatives. W.D. Hamilton formalized this with the concept of inclusive fitness. Your total genetic success isn't just about your own kids. It also includes the reproductive success of your relatives, weighted by how closely related you are.
Okay, so helping your brother or sister helps your shared genes.
Precisely. Hamilton's rule gives us the mathematical logic, RBC. An altruistic act is favored by evolution if the genetic relatedness to the person you're helping times the benefit they receive is greater than the cost to you. Your R is 0.5 with a parent, child, or full sibling, 0.25 with a grandchild or nephew, niece, and so on. This simple rule explains why we have such powerful, seemingly innate loyalties and altruism toward family. It's the biological bedrock of nepotism, really, and the foundation of the earliest human social structures.
That makes sense for family. But we cooperate with non-relatives all the time. How did that evolve? It doesn't fit Hamilton's rule.
Right. That's where the second major explanation comes in. Reciprocal altruism. This was Robert Triver's big idea. It explains cooperation between unrelated individuals. Basically, it's I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. You do something costly for someone now, with the expectation, maybe not even conscious, that they'll return the favor later. This strategy can evolve if the long-term benefit of receiving help when you need it outweighs the short-term cost of giving help now. But crucially, for this to work, you need certain conditions. You need repeated interactions between the same individuals. And you need the cognitive machinery to remember who helped you, who you helped, and especially who didn't return the favor, the cheaters. You need to be able to punish or avoid them.
So managing all that reciprocity requires some complex psychology.
Exactly. And this need likely shaped our emotional landscape profoundly. Many of our moral emotions probably evolved to regulate this system of give and take. Gratitude motivates us to remember and reward those who helped us. Guilt pushes us to make amends if we failed to reciprocate, to repair the relationship. Sympathy prompts us to help others in need, maybe building up social credit. Friendship and liking help us identify reliable long-term partners for this reciprocity. And that feeling of moralistic aggression or righteous anger, that likely evolved to motivate us to punish cheaters who violate the social contract.
So kin selection for family, reciprocal altruism for others, these are the building blocks of cooperation.
They're like the core subroutines for the cooperative side of the tribal algorithm. They explain why our loyalties often seem to work in concentric circles. Strongest for immediate family, then extending out to close friends and community members where reciprocity is frequent, and weakest for distant strangers, where these mechanisms don't apply as strongly. But here's the crucial and maybe darker flip side. These very mechanisms that evolved to foster in-group cooperation also lay the groundwork for out-group conflict. Think about it. The ability to distinguish trustworthy partners from potential cheaters is essential for reciprocity. But that system can be easily generalized. When you encounter someone from outside your known network, someone other, the default setting can easily become suspicion. You might unconsciously tag them as a potential cheater or threat simply because they're unknown. That sophisticated cheater detection system, designed for individuals within your group, can get overextended to view entire outgroups as inherently untrustworthy, maybe even parasitic. That's the direct evolutionary path from the light side of cooperation to the potential dark side of intergroup hostility.
So our minds aren't always making slow, careful calculations. They're using shortcuts, heuristics. The source calls us cognitive misers. What are these specific mental biases, these shortcuts, that the tribal algorithm actually uses to create and maintain this us versus them divide?
Right. The algorithm runs on these rapid, often unconscious, mental shortcuts, cognitive biases. They probably helped us make quick decisions for survival in small, relatively stable ancestral groups. But in our large, diverse modern societies, they can really fuel prejudice and conflict. One huge one is confirmation bias. We all do this. We tend to seek out, interpret, and remember information that confirms what we already believe. And we tend to ignore or dismiss information that challenges our beliefs. This is incredibly powerful in intergroup relations. If you hold a negative stereotype about another group, say they are lazy, you'll unconsciously notice every instance that seems to support it and ignore mountains of evidence to the contrary. It makes stereotypes incredibly sticky and resistant to change.
Yeah, you see what you expect to see.
Exactly. Then there's the outgroup homogeneity bias. This is the tendency to see members of outgroups as much more similar to each other than members of our own group are. We see us as unique individuals, full of variety, but we see them as a kind of monolithic block. They are all alike. This simplifies the social world, sure, but it's a primary driver of stereotyping. By erasing individuality, it makes it much easier to apply broad, often negative generalizations to an entire group. It's a key step towards dehumanization, actually.
And what about how we explain behavior?
That's the fundamental attribution error, sometimes called the correspondence bias. This is a big one. We tend to explain other people's negative actions by attributing them to their internal character or disposition. They did that because they're a bad person. But when we do something similar, we explain it by pointing to external circumstances. I had no choice. The situation made me do it. In conflicts, this creates a really toxic dynamic. Their aggression is proof of their evil nature. Our aggression is just a necessary, justified response to what they did. This fundamental asymmetry in how we explain behavior makes mutual understanding incredibly difficult.
So we give ourselves a pass, but not them.
Pretty much. And the most direct output of all this is simply in-group favoritism.
Yeah.
That automatic, often unconscious tendency to evaluate and treat members of our own group more positively than members of outgroups. And you can see how these biases feed each other, right? You have a negative encounter with someone from an outgroup. You attribute it to their bad character, fundamental attribution error. You generalize that flaw to their entire group because they're all alike, outgroup homogeneity. You then only notice future information confirming this negative view, confirmation bias. All of this reinforces your preference for your own group, in-group favoritism, and your hostility towards the other. It's a powerful cognitive loop. And it helps explain why group conflicts and prejudices can be so incredibly persistent and resistant to purely rational arguments. It's baked into how our minds process social information shortcuts.
Okay, this is fascinating. We can actually take these psychological tendencies, these biases, and model their strategic logic using something called game theory. It helps reveal the underlying math, almost, of why cooperation is hard and conflict happens.
Yes, exactly. Game theory is basically the mathematical study of strategic interaction. It uses simplified models, games, to understand the decisions people or groups make when their success depends on what others do. It's great for understanding social dilemmas relevant to the tribal algorithm.
Like the famous prisoner's dilemma.
That's the classic, yeah. It perfectly illustrates why cooperation can be so difficult, even when it's mutually beneficial. You've got two players. They can choose to cooperate or defect. The key is the payoff structure. Temptation to defect, T, is better than the reward for mutual cooperation, which is better than the punishment for mutual defection, P, which is better than being the sucker who cooperates while the other defects, S. So TRPS, no matter what the other player does, defecting gives you a better individual outcome in that single round. So if it's just a one-shot game, the rational choice for both players is to defect, leading to mutual punishment, P, even though mutual cooperation, R, would have been better for both.
But cooperation does happen in the real world.
Right, because life isn't usually a one-shot game. In the iterated prisoner's dilemma, where the game is played repeatedly, cooperation can definitely emerge. Strategies like tit-for-tat cooperate initially, then do whatever the other player did last round often prove very successful. It rewards cooperation and punishes defection. This beautifully models reciprocal altruism and shows how the shadow of the future, the prospect of future interactions, can make cooperation the rational long-term strategy.
Okay, so that's about cooperation versus cheating. What other games does the source mention?
Well, there's the stag hunt. This model's a different kind of problem. Not cheating, but trust and coordination. Imagine two hunters. They can cooperate to hunt a stag, big reward, but requires both. Or either can defect and hunt a hare alone, smaller reward, but guaranteed. The best outcome for the group is hunting the stag together, but it's risky. If you commit to the stag and your partner chickens out and goes for a hare, you get nothing. This game highlights how crucial trust and assurance are for achieving high-reward cooperation. It has two stable outcomes: both hunt stag or both hunt hare. Getting to the better outcomes is risky. It models situations needing collective trust, like maybe tackling climate change or building community projects.
And conflict. Is there a game for that?
Yes, the hawk-dove game. This models aggression and conflicts over a resource. Players can choose an aggressive hawk strategy, fight, or passive dove strategy, display but retreat if challenged. If a hawk meets a dove, the hawk takes the resource. If two doves meet, they share peacefully. If two hawks meet, they fight, and both risk injury or cost. This game shows that being purely aggressive isn't always the best strategy, especially if the cost of fighting is high relative to the value of the resource. Often, the stable strategy in a population is a mix of hawks and doves. It helps explain why both aggressive and more peaceful strategies tend to coexist.
So these different games model different aspects of the tribal algorithm.
You could look at it that way. The stag hunt captures the challenge of achieving in-group cooperation and coordination. The prisoner's dilemma highlights the tension between that in-group cooperation and individual self-interest, the temptation to defect. And the hawk-dove game models the dynamics of out-group conflict over resources. And what's really key, from the science of history perspective, is understanding how the parameters of these games, the payoffs, the costs, the benefits, change over time. Think about how agriculture dramatically increased the value of land, likely making hawk-dove conflicts more intense, or how the development of strong legal systems increases the punishment for defecting in large-scale prisoners' dilemmas, making cooperation more stable. History constantly changes the payoff matrix.
Okay, let's shift gears and look at how this tribal algorithm has played out on the really big stage. Starting with how societies organize themselves politically, the source seems to link this directly to conflict.
It does, quite strongly. The argument is that large-scale political organization, especially the rise of the state, wasn't some nice, peaceful evolution towards efficiency. It was largely a brutal, competitive process, driven fundamentally by intergroup conflict. The conflict side of the tribal algorithm, basically. The modern state, in this view, is a direct descendant of millennia of warfare.
Warfare was really that common.
The anthropological and archaeological evidence suggests it was incredibly pervasive, endemic, really, for millennia. From small-scale raids among hunter-gatherer groups right through to the massive, organized wars of recorded history, it seems to be a recurring feature of human social life. And this fits with something called realistic conflict theory. The basic idea is that a primary driver of hostility and prejudice between groups is simple competition over scarce resources. When groups need the same limited things, land, water, wealth, power conflict, and negative attitudes towards the competitors arise pretty predictably. Remember the Robbers Cave experiment the source mentions. Just putting two groups of boys into competition for prizes was enough to generate intense in-group loyalty and really nasty outgroup hostility. Scale that dynamic up globally over thousands of years, and you have a fundamental engine-shaping history.
So competition leads to conflict. How does that lead to states?
This leads to a core idea, often summarized as war makes states and states make war. It's a theory with roots going back to Ibn Khaldun, but developed by modern sociologists too. The idea is that intense and sustained intergroup conflict creates powerful, selective pressure. Societies that were better organized for war tended to survive and win. To compete effectively, groups needed to scale up. They needed stronger leadership, clearer hierarchies, better ways to extract resources like taxes to fund war efforts, and ways to unify their population to get people willing to fight and die for the group. In essence, war forced groups to become more organized and centralized. Small bands got absorbed or conquered by larger chiefdoms. Chiefdoms got incorporated into early states. The state itself can be seen as an adaptation that proved highly successful in this environment of chronic intergroup conflict. And of course, once you have a powerful state, it's better equipped to wage more war, creating this feedback loop, the sort of arms race of social and political organization. The societies that survived and expanded were often the ones most effective at mobilizing their populations for conflict.
So the conflicts between groups actually drove the creation of larger, more organized groups within. And the modern nation-state is where this process has led us.
Yes, the modern nation-state is often seen as the the apotheosis of this whole process. It scales up the tribal algorithm to encompass potentially hundreds of millions of people. Nationalism is the incredibly powerful ideology that binds all these genetically unrelated strangers together into one cohesive in-group, the nation. It fosters this shared identity, loyalty, sense of common destiny, which makes possible the immense collective action needed for things like industrial warfare. Now, patriotism can absolutely be a positive civic virtue, but its fusion with the power of the modern state has also driven some of history's most destructive conflicts, harnessing modern economies and technologies for intergroup competition on an unprecedented scale.
There's a real paradox there, isn't there? Conflict driving cooperation.
It's a crucial paradox identified in the source. External conflict often fosters internal cooperation. Facing an outside threat is an incredibly powerful unifying force. It tends to suppress internal divisions, promote altruism within the group, encourage self-sacrifice for the collective. This is a key insight from what's called cultural multi-level selection theory, the idea that competition between groups is a major force driving the evolution of cooperation within groups. The dominant empires and nations throughout history are, to a large extent, the winners of this brutal group-level evolutionary tournament.
And leaders can exploit this, right? The common enemy idea.
Absolutely. The common enemy is one of the oldest and most potent tools for political mobilization. Remember Robbers Cave again. What finally reduced the hostility between the two groups of boys was introducing a superordinate goal, a problem they both had to solve together, like fixing a camp's water supply. An external enemy is the ultimate superordinate goal. Leaders throughout history have consciously or unconsciously unified divided populations by identifying or sometimes manufacturing an outside threat. It channels internal frustrations and aggression outwards. It's a powerful and often very cynical application of the tribal algorithm to consolidate power.
Okay, so if conflict is the engine, the source suggests that belief systems, especially religions, are like the sophisticated software directing that energy, defining the us and them.
That's a very good way to capture the idea presented. Religions are described as powerful evolutionary technologies, essentially, for programming the tribal algorithm. They are incredibly effective at defining group boundaries, enforcing group norms, and motivating both intense cooperation within the group and sometimes intense conflict with other groups.
How do they foster that in-group cooperation so well?
From an evolutionary perspective, they seem to use several key mechanisms. First, shared identity and belonging. Religions provide these comprehensive worldviews, moral codes, rituals, traditions. They satisfy that deep human need for identity, purpose, and belonging in a way that often goes way beyond simple kinship. Second, costly signaling. Many religious practices involve sacrifices, dietary restrictions, time-consuming rituals, giving up resources. These are seen as costly signals. They're hard to fake. Participating signals your genuine commitment to the group and its beliefs, which helps identify trustworthy cooperators and weeds out potential free riders. And third, supernatural monitoring and punishment. The belief in powerful, all-seeing gods who know your thoughts and punish hidden transgressions is a very effective way to enforce pro-social behavior, even when no humans are watching. Fear of divine retribution can powerfully increase self-control and generosity within the religious community.
But that same power can be turned outwards, right? Driving conflict.
Absolutely. The very features that make religion so good at binding groups together also make it incredibly potent for fueling conflict between groups. Creating a strong moral community often involves drawing a very sharp line between the faithful, us, and outsiders, them, who might be seen as infidels, heathens, or obstacles to divine will. The Force notes research suggesting that religious infusion, how deeply religion permeates public and private life, can be a strong predictor of prejudice, discrimination, and support for intergroup violence in certain contexts. Religion can provide powerful divine justifications for conflict, facilitate the dehumanization of enemies, they're evil, they're subhuman, and offer supernatural rewards like martyrdom, making it an incredibly potent force for mobilizing people for war.
So it has this dual nature, cooperation inside, potential conflict outside.
Exactly. It's a fascinating paradox. The source mentions psychological research, where priming people with the general concept of religion tends to increase in-group favoritism. But priming them specifically with the concept of God can sometimes activate more universal pro-social thoughts, like fairness to strangers. This might hint at a distinction between the social, institutional, group-binding aspects of religion, which strongly reinforce the tribal algorithm, and the more abstract moral or theological aspects, which can sometimes push towards a more universal ethic.
That's interesting. So, how have different major world religions actually navigated this tension, this pull between duties to the in-group versus duties to everyone?
The source offers a brief comparative look, highlighting this ongoing struggle within different traditions. It's a core tension. If you look at the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism clearly has a strong particularist element with the idea of a chosen people and the detailed laws, mitzvot, governing Jewish life. But it also contains universal moral principles, like the 7 laws of Noah considered binding on all humanity. Christianity often embodies this tension directly. There's a strong emphasis on the family of believers, the in-group, but then you have radical teachings like love your enemies and the parable of the Good Samaritan, which dramatically expands the definition of neighbor. It often seems to hold both particularist and universalist impulses together. Islam has the powerful concept of the Ummah, the global community of Muslims, a very strong in-group identity. Historically, the early constitution of Medina under Muhammad was remarkably inclusive of different groups. Later interpretations sometimes became more focused on the religious identity, though traditionally people of the book, Jews and Christians, were granted protected status within Muslim lands.
And the Dharmic traditions from India.
There too, Hinduism has the concept of Swadharma, one's specific duty according to one's caste and stage of life, which is inherently particularist and hierarchical. But alongside that, you have Sadhana Dharma, universal duties like nonviolence, ahimsa, compassion, truthfulness that apply to everyone. So there's a constant interplay. Buddhism is presented in the source as perhaps the most consistently universalist in its core teachings. The central ethic is compassion for all sentient beings, without distinction. Concepts like karma and reincarnation tend to dissolve rigid group boundaries over lifetimes, and the ideal of the bodhisattva is someone who postpones their own enlightenment to help all beings escape suffering. So you can see the history of religion in one sense is this continuous struggle to reconcile our evolved tribal particularism with our growing capacity for universal moral reasoning. Each tradition offers different answers, different ways of managing that tension, and those answers have profoundly shaped different civilizations.
Okay, so the same psychological engine, the tribal algorithm, that enables incredible loyalty and cooperation. It also contains the seeds, the blueprint for our most destructive behaviors. The dark side isn't separate. It's like an extreme manifestation of the same group psychology. Prejudice is just the toxic flip side of in-group loyalty.
That's exactly the perspective offered. The dark side isn't seen as fundamentally different, but as a logical, though obviously horrific, potential outcome when the tribal algorithm operates unchecked or is deliberately manipulated and weaponized. Take something like rule breaking. It's not always simple defiance. Sure, personality or environment play a role. But in an intergroup context, deliberately breaking the rules or norms of another culture can be a powerful statement. It can be about asserting your own group's identity or dominance, resisting what you see as unfair rules imposed by others, or demonstrating loyalty to your own group's ways. Sometimes breaking their rules feels like upholding ours. And things like prejudice, stereotyping, xenophobia that fear or dislike of foreigners are presented as direct, almost predictable outputs of the competitive side of the tribal algorithm. Xenophobia seems rooted in an evolved wariness of outsiders who might pose a threat to physical safety, to resources, to cultural norms. This fear often gets amplified during times of insecurity or scarcity, making outgroups convenient scapegoats. Ethnocentrism, the belief that your own culture's ways are the right ways. The standard is a natural consequence of in-group favoritism. It provides a sort of moral and psychological justification for looking down on or discriminating against others whose ways are different, may be seen as primitive or inferior.
The source also points to leadership playing a really dark role here sometimes, linking it to specific personality traits.
Yes, it brings up the concept of the dark triad of personality traits. That's narcissism, a sense of grandiosity, entitlement, needing admiration, Machiavellianism, being manipulative, exploitative, cynical, and psychopathy, lacking empathy, remorse, having shallow emotions, being impulsive. Individuals who score high on these traits, the source argues, are often particularly adept at exploiting the tribal algorithm for their own gain. They can be charismatic, rise to power, and then skillfully weaponize intergroup tensions. They stoke fear and hatred of outgroups to rally their own base, consolidate their power, and justify aggression.
Which leads, in the most extreme cases, to genocide.
Exactly. Genocide, the deliberate attempt to exterminate an entire ethnic, racial, or religious group, is seen as the ultimate, most horrific manifestation of this dark potential. But the source stresses it's not usually a spontaneous outburst of madness. It's typically the culmination of a predictable and potentially preventable process. It mentions Gregory Stanton's well-known 10 stages of genocide, which start with basic classification, us versus them, and move through escalating steps like symbolization, forcing identifiers, dehumanization, comparing the outgroup to animals or disease, organization, polarization, eliminating moderates, preparation, persecution, and finally extermination. And crucially, the analysis emphasizes that the perpetrators of genocide are often not clinically insane. They are frequently psychologically normal people who have been subjected to intense indoctrination and propaganda, often orchestrated by leaders high in those dark triad traits. Through this process, they come to genuinely believe that the victim group poses an existential threat to their own group's survival and that elimination is necessary. It's the systematic weaponization of those cognitive biases we talked about earlier. Dehumanization, for instance, exploits the outgroup homogeneity bias to its extreme, making it psychologically easier to inflict violence by short-circuiting empathy. Genocide is what happens when the tribal algorithm is deliberately pushed to its most malevolent conclusion.
Wow. Okay, this scientific understanding seems to loop us right back to some of the oldest philosophical questions humans have asked. Like, are we fundamentally good or evil? Does society corrupt us, or does it save us from ourselves?
Exactly. And how we answer those questions has huge implications, right? It shapes our whole understanding of what society is for and what the role of government should really be. The source brings up Thomas Hobbes, writing during the chaos of the English Civil War. He famously argued that the state of nature, life without government, would be a war of every man against every man. He saw humans as fundamentally self-interested, driven by a relentless desire for power and the fear of death. Life, he said, would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So for Hobbes, the solution was the social contract. People give up their natural freedoms to an absolute sovereign, the Leviathan, in exchange for order, peace, and security. The primary problem of human nature was our inherent tendency towards conflict, and government's main job was to restrain that. Order above all.
But Rousseau had a completely different take, didn't he?
Diametrically opposed, really. Writing about a century later, Rousseau argued that humans in the state of nature were actually good, peaceful, even solitary, the noble savage. Motivated by self-preservation, yes, but also by a natural pity or compassion, pity for the suffering of others. Rousseau believed it was society that corrupted us, especially the invention of private property, which led to inequality, which in turn bred envy, pride, competition, and conflict. For him, the main problem wasn't our inherent nature, but the corrupting influence of inequality and the loss of our natural freedom. His idea of the social contract was about creating a political community guided by the general will to restore freedom and equality.
So where does this modern science, this tribal algorithm idea fit in? Does it side with Hobbes or Rousseau?
What's fascinating is that the source suggests it offers a kind of synthesis. It implies both Hobbes and Rousseau were partially right, but they both missed the crucial group dimension. Hobbes was right in a sense that we are fundamentally self-interested, at the genetic level anyway, and that our evolved nature isn't automatically suited for peaceful coexistence in large, anonymous societies without strong social structures. Left to our own devices between groups, conflict is likely. Rousseau was right that we have a deep, innate capacity for empathy, compassion, and cooperation. But the tribal algorithm perspective says this capacity is conditional. Our nature isn't simply good or evil, it's intensely groupish. We are powerfully wired to be good, cooperative, altruistic, empathetic, but primarily towards members of our perceived in-group. And we are simultaneously wired with the potential to be bad, competitive, suspicious, hostile, even ruthless toward perceived outgroups.
So the best form of government depends on what you're trying to manage.
That seems to be the implication. If the main threat is external conflict between groups, you might need a stronger, more centralized, perhaps more Hobbesian state for defense and mobilization. If the main threat is internal conflict, often driven by inequality or factionalism, you might need a more participatory, perhaps more Rousseauian system focused on fairness, inclusion, and managing internal divisions. History, from this viewpoint, looks like a long series of experiments in trying to manage these dual threats, the threat of external anarchy and the threat of internal tyranny or collapse. Cliodynamics tries to model the factors that push societies towards instability. A critical question for political design then becomes, how do you structure government to incentivize leaders to actually balance the need for order with the need for justice, given our dual nature?
This understanding of our conditional, groupish nature really brings us face to face with what the source calls humanity's most profound ethical dilemma. This clash between particularism and universalism. Our evolved hearts pull one way, towards our own, but our capacity for reason can grasp a bigger picture.
Yes, this is framed as the core ethical tension. The pull between particularism, the deeply felt moral intuition that our duties are stronger towards those closer to us, our family, friends, community, nation, us, and universalism, the rational or philosophical principle that moral rules should apply equally to all human beings simply because they share a common humanity. It's this constant struggle between the heart's powerful, evolved loyalties to the few and the mind's ability to conceive of universal justice for the many.
How do different ethical systems try to resolve this?
The source touches on how major ethical frameworks grapple with it. Utilitarianism, aiming for the greatest good for the greatest number, is inherently universalist and impartial. From a strict utilitarian view, favoring your own family or country over strangers is a form of bias to be overcome. All sentient beings' interests should ideally count equally. Bentham, Mill, Peter Singer are key figures here. Then you have deontology, most famously associated with Kant. Morality here isn't about outcomes, but about adhering to universal duties or rules. Kant's categorical imperative insists you should act only according to principles you could will to be universal laws, and always treat humanity, in yourself or others, as an end, never merely as a means. This is fundamentally universalist and provides a strong philosophical grounding for the idea of universal human rights. Virtue ethics, going back to Aristotle, takes a different approach. It focuses on cultivating good character traits or virtues, and loyalty is often considered a key virtue. But loyalty, by its very nature, is particularist. It demands partiality towards those to whom you are loyal. The source quotes the philosopher Roger Scruton, arguing that this partiality isn't a moral flaw, but actually a prerequisite for building the trust and community necessary for a good life. This puts virtue ethics in direct tension with the strict impartiality demanded by utilitarianism and deontology.
And this philosophical tension plays out directly in politics, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's right at the heart of debates between patriotism and cosmopolitanism. Patriotism and nationalism are essentially the political expression of particularist loyalty to one's national in-group. They can inspire incredible civic virtue, solidarity, and sacrifice for the common good within the nation. But as we've seen, they can also foster exclusivity, xenophobia, and the prioritization of national interests, even at the expense of universal human rights or global well-being. Cosmopolitanism, on the other hand, emphasizes our identity as citizens of the world, members of a single global community. It argues that our primary moral obligations extend beyond national borders, advocating for global justice, international cooperation, and universal human rights. Critics, as the source notes, sometimes argue that cosmopolitanism can feel too abstract or detached, perhaps loving humanity in general but neglecting concrete duties to neighbors, and that it risks eroding the particular loyalties that provide meaning and social cohesion. The source doesn't offer an easy resolution. It suggests that pure universalism, completely ignoring our deep-seated loyalties, might be psychologically unrealistic and could dissolve the very bonds that make society possible. But pure particularism, unchecked loyalty only to one's own group, is morally catastrophic and has justified countless atrocities throughout history. So, a proper human culture, in this view, has to find a way to navigate this tension. It means cultivating healthy, nested loyalties to family, community, nation, but always constraining them within a robust, non-negotiable commitment to universal human dignity and a recognition of our shared responsibility for the planet.
Okay, so if we take all this science seriously and we actually want to build a more stable, balanced, prosperous future, how do we apply these insights? How do we manage diversity and stop the tribal algorithm from constantly pulling us into conflict? The source really emphasizes system design, not just hoping we elect good people.
That's a really central conclusion. The fundamental challenge is designing institutions, political, social, economic, that can manage our inherent diversity peacefully and productively. The argument is that the structure of the system itself is perhaps the most important choice we make, because the system shapes incentives and behavior. The source outlines several models that have been used, with varying success, to manage intergroup conflict, acknowledging that the best fit depends heavily on the specific context. One is federalism. Dividing power between a central government and regional units gives distinct groups, especially geographically concentrated ones, significant autonomy over their own local affairs, things like education, culture, language policy. Think of Switzerland with its cantons, or Canada with its provinces and language rights. Another model, designed for societies with deeply divided groups that live mixed together, is consociationalism. This is basically mandatory power sharing. It usually has four key features: a grand coalition government, including elites from all major segments, proportional representation throughout government and public funding, a high degree of autonomy for each segment to manage its own internal affairs, and crucially, a mutual veto, allowing minority groups to block legislation they see as threatening their vital interests. It's complex, often used in post-conflict situations like Northern Ireland or Bosnia, aiming for stability by preventing any one group from dominating others. Beyond specific models, the source addresses the importance of overarching principles of inclusive governance. That means ensuring meaningful participation for all groups, transparency, accountability, equity, social justice, and policies. These principles are vital for building the trust and legitimacy needed for social cohesion, especially in diverse or post-conflict societies.
And how we vote makes a big difference, too. The electoral system itself.
A critical piece, yes. How votes get translated into political representation has a huge impact on intergroup dynamics. Majoritarian winner-take-all systems, like first-past-the-post used in the US and UK, tend to exacerbate tribalism in politics. They often create a binary us-versus-them political landscape, incentivize parties to appeal mainly to their core base rather than seeking broader consensus, marginalize smaller parties and minority groups, and studies show they tend to increase effective polarization. That is, partisans don't just disagree, they actively dislike and distrust supporters of the other party.
So what's the alternative?
Proportional representation, PR systems, where seats in the legislature are allocated roughly in proportion to the votes each party receives, are generally seen as more effective at fostering inclusion in diverse societies. PR ensures that minority parties and viewpoints gain representation, which encourage the formation of coalition governments, forcing parties to negotiate, compromise, and accommodate different interests rather than just aiming for 51% control. So the core argument here is about incentives. If you want to cultivate more cooperative, inclusive political leaders and reduce toxic polarization, you need to design political and electoral systems that actually reward those behaviors. Systems combining proportional representation with principles of inclusive and, where appropriate, federal or consociational governance seem to offer a more robust framework for politically managing the downsides of the tribal algorithm.
Okay, so institutions are key for that top-down structure. But what about addressing the psychological roots directly? Can we do anything from the bottom up? Are there ways to actively maybe hack our tribal psychology for the better?
Yes, the analysis strongly emphasizes that institutional reform needs to be paired with efforts targeting the psychological roots. You can't just change the rules. You also need to try and change hearts and minds. The good news is, research in social psychology offers several evidence-based strategies for doing just that, essentially leveraging our pro-social tendencies to override the hostile ones. One of the most powerful findings, going back to Gordon Allport, is the contact hypothesis. The basic idea is that positive, direct contact between members of different groups can significantly reduce prejudice. But it's not just any contact. For it to work best, certain conditions usually need to be met. The group should ideally have equal status in the situation. They need to work towards common goals that require mutual effort. There needs to be intergroup cooperation, not competition. And crucially, the contact needs support from authorities, laws, or social norms. When these conditions are met, contact seems to work by reducing anxiety about the outgroup, increasing empathy and perspective-taking, and breaking down negative stereotypes through personal experience.
Does it have to be direct contact?
Interestingly, no. The source mentions research showing even indirect forms of contact can be effective. Things like knowing someone in your own group who has a close friend in the outgroup, extended contact, observing positive interactions, vicarious contact, or even just vividly imagining a positive interaction with an outgroup member can reduce prejudice. There are field experiments, like between farmers and herders in conflict zones in Nigeria, showing structured contact programs can lead to more positive attitudes and even better security. Another key approach is fostering dialogue and deliberation. This isn't about debate where you try to win. It's about structured, facilitated communication specifically designed to promote mutual understanding and empathy between groups. Creating safe spaces where people can share personal stories, listen deeply to others' experiences, and re-examine their own assumptions can be incredibly powerful for transforming conflict dynamics and building relationships needed for collaboration. These kinds of programs are used effectively in schools, workplaces, communities all over.
What about tapping into that group identity idea itself?
Yes, that's recategorization. It's a strategy straight out of social identity theory. The idea is to consciously foster a common, superordinate in-group identity that includes members of previously distinct us and them groups. So you recategorize people into a new, broader we. Think about emphasizing a shared company identity to bridge departmental divides, or a common national identity to overcome regional ones. And effective leadership is crucial here too. Leaders who are seen as transformational, ethical, and focused on shared goals play a vital role in promoting this sense of common identity and guiding groups towards resolving conflicts collaboratively. And finally, educational interventions are highlighted as a absolutely critical long-term strategy. Teaching critical thinking skills and metacognition thinking about how we think can help individuals become more aware of their own cognitive biases, like confirmation bias or the fundamental attribution error, and learn to consciously counteract them. Incorporating diverse perspectives, histories, and stories into the curriculum is also essential for promoting empathy, challenging stereotypes from a young age, and building a more inclusive understanding of the world and its peoples.
So it's not just one thing, it's attacking the problem from multiple angles.
Exactly. The conclusion is that a successful strategy has to be multi-level. You need the top-down institutional reforms, creating fairer systems, better rules. But those are unlikely to be sufficient on their own without simultaneous bottom-up efforts to address the psychological roots through contact, dialogue, recategorization, and education. Fair laws are necessary, but they work best when people's underlying attitudes and beliefs also begin to shift.
Okay, let's bring this right up to the present. What does all of this science and history mean for the huge planetary challenges we're facing right now? Things like climate change, pandemics, massive global inequality. Are these also, in some way, expressions of the tribal algorithm playing out on a global scale?
The source makes a very strong case that yes, they are. And this presents humanity with arguably its greatest paradox. The very evolutionary mechanism, the tribal algorithm for in-group cooperation and out-group competition that allowed our ancestors to survive in small groups for millennia, is now potentially the single biggest threat to our collective survival in the 21st century. There's this fundamental mismatch between our ancient minds, optimized for competing between small, local groups, and the complex realities of our modern, globalized, interconnected, and technologically powerful world. These huge global challenges, climate, pandemics, inequality, are fundamentally collective action problems. They are intergroup dilemmas writ large. And they simply cannot be solved effectively if humanity remains fractured into thousands of competing tribes, each prioritizing its own short-term interests.
How does climate change fit that model, for example?
Climate change is described as a classic planetary tragedy of the commons. It's like a massive multiplayer prisoner's dilemma. Each nation's rational short-term self-interest might be to continue polluting or delay costly mitigation efforts to defect in game theory terms, hoping others will bear the burden. But if everyone defects, the collective outcome is potential catastrophe for all. The tribal algorithm makes this even worse. Climate action often gets framed not as a shared struggle for planetary survival, but as a zero-sum economic competition between nations. If we cut emissions, they'll gain an advantage. This us versus them thinking hinders the global cooperation that's absolutely essential.
And pandemics, we saw some of this recently.
Absolutely. Pandemics, by definition, don't respect borders. Combating them effectively requires unprecedented global cooperation and surveillance, sharing data, research, and especially ensuring equitable distribution of resources like vaccines and treatments. Instead, what we often saw during the COVID crisis was the tribal algorithm kicking into high gear in its negative forms. Surges in xenophobia and scapegoating, vaccine nationalism where wealthy nations hoarded supplies primarily for their own in-group, and a dangerous breakdown of international trust and cooperation precisely when it was needed most.
And inequality, how does that fit the tribal picture?
Economic inequality, both within nations and between the global north and south, acts as a powerful fuel for resentment, social friction, and political polarization. It deepens the U.S. versus them, divides, erodes social cohesion, and undermines the trust that's necessary for societies to tackle complex, long-term problems together. It makes societies more fragile, more inward-looking, less capable of collective action. So the imperative, according to this analysis, is the conscious creation of a superordinate identity. We need a shared goal that necessitates cooperation across all the traditional tribal lines, national, ethnic, religious, political. It's the robber's cave solution, scaled up to the entire planet. The ultimate superordinate goal for the 21st century has to be building a sustainable, peaceful, and prosperous global civilization for everyone. But achieving that requires a profound psychological shift. It requires actively fostering an identity as members of a single human family, sharing a single planetary home. We need to learn how to scale up those powerful instincts for loyalty, empathy, and cooperation instincts that evolve for our kin and clan, and consciously apply them to the entire human species.
So based on everything we've unpacked from this science, what would a proper human culture actually look like today? How do we consciously try to build a more balanced future, knowing what we know about the tribal algorithm?
Building that proper human culture is presented as a deliberate, conscious project. It requires synthesizing insights from ethics, governance, and education, all specifically designed to help us understand and transcend the limitations of our evolved psychology when necessary. Ethically, the source points toward something like a pragmatic cosmopolitanism. It acknowledges our natural nested loyalties are real and important, but insists they must be balanced and constrained by an overriding, robust commitment to universal human rights, global justice, and shared planetary stewardship. It's an ethic grounded in principles like maximizing collective benefit, ensuring fairness and equity, acting transparently, and prioritizing the well-being of future generations and the planet itself. In terms of governance at the national level, it means implementing those inclusive, deliberative models we discussed, designed to manage internal diversity constructively and reduce polarization. At the international level, it means strengthening global institutions and agreements, things like the WHO, climate accords, human rights treaties that facilitate cooperation, promote equity between nations, and provide effective frameworks for tackling shared global challenges together. But perhaps the single most critical long-term investment highlighted is in education, specifically promoting global citizenship education, GCED. The goal here is to consciously equip learners everywhere with the knowledge, the skills, and critically the values needed to act as responsible citizens, not just of their nation, but of the world. GCED actively works to cultivate empathy across group lines, foster critical thinking about biases and propaganda, promote respect for diversity, and build a conscious sense of belonging to the larger human community. By teaching about our shared evolutionary history, our common psychological wiring, including the tribal algorithm, and our deeply interconnected fate on this small planet, it directly counters the divisive us versus them narratives and helps nurture that essential sense of common humanity we desperately need. Ultimately, the purpose of this whole scientific endeavor, the science of human history, isn't just academic curiosity about the past. It's about gaining the profound self-knowledge we need to navigate the incredibly complex challenges of the future. It integrates the vast time scale of big history, the analytical power of cryodynamics, and the deep insights of evolutionary psychology to reveal the recurring patterns and the fundamental engine driving so much of our collective behavior.
Yeah, it really lays bare this central drama, doesn't it? Our ongoing struggle with our own nature, this constant tension within the tribal algorithm between its incredible power for cooperation and loyalty, and its equally powerful potential for competition and conflict. It shows how our greatest strengths and our most terrifying weaknesses often spring from the very same evolutionary root.
And we're in a unique position. Possibly as a species, we're perhaps the first species capable of scientifically studying its own evolution, analyzing the deep psychological software that drives its behavior. And through this science, we can clearly see the dangerous mismatch between minds largely shaped for survival in small ancestral tribes and the realities of our modern, hyper-connected, technologically superpowered global world.
So the point of this science isn't just to diagnose the problem, it's trying to provide a scientifically informed roadmap for what amounts to a necessary cultural and psychological evolution. It gives us the understanding, maybe, to consciously manage our instincts better, to deliberately design institutions that encourage our better angels, as Lincoln put it, and crucially, to educate future generations to see themselves not just as members of this tribe or that nation, but as members of a single species, sharing a common home and facing a common destiny.
Exactly. By truly understanding the science of our own history, the deep patterns and the underlying algorithm, we gain an unprecedented power. The power to consciously choose a future that isn't just a blind repetition of the past's conflicts and tragedies.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. If this science is right, if our brains really are wired with this powerful us versus them algorithm, what is one concrete thing you can do today, maybe this week, in your own life to consciously push back against that automatic programming, to maybe strengthen a connection, even a small one, with someone you might typically perceive as them? What small act of bridging that divide, however minor it seems, could be your personal contribution to consciously shaping a slightly different future? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
This is DigitView.